Hi class, let's get started with our discussion on host defenses. How do we keep from getting sick? As we look at this chapter is going to be kind of a review chapter for you. It's going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the adaptive and some of the non-specific defenses. It's most specifically going to focus on our non-specific or innate immune system with a small emphasis on our adaptive immune system. So, without further ado, let's jump in. Now, our first line of defense is typically going to be something that blocks the pathogen from getting in. Now we have multiple levels of defenses in our body. We have that first line of defense that keeps the pathogen from getting in, but if something gets in, we're going to have other mechanisms in place. Some of these mechanisms that are in our body are non-specific. They can work against anything that gets in our body, and we also have specific immunities or specific mechanisms in our body that are going to target pathogens or disease-causing microbes that have already gotten into our body or that we've already been exposed to. We typically are going to have our first, second, and third lines of defense. So let's talk about that first line of defense. This first line of defense keeps the bad guys out, so to speak. Super duper general in action. So we're going to have mechanisms on the outside of our body and kind of on the inside of our body, depending on your frame of reference. Some people consider the respiratory tracts and the gastrointestinal tract as part of the outside of the body because it has access to the external environment. Some people consider it inside of your body. These barriers that we have to keep stuff out of our body aren't considered a true immune response because they don't recognize any foreign objects or foreign antigens, so to speak. The second line of defense that we have in us, let's say, will function or kick in if something gets past that first line. It's going to get, if the pathogen gets into our body, we still have some generalized defenses to help eliminate that pathogen once it gets into our body. These defenses are going to be in the fluids of our bodies, and it will be consisting of generalized protective cells. It also consists of generalized responses to the pathogen. Some of these responses include inflammation or phagocytosis from our phagocytotically active cells. And these second lines of defenses are fairly rapid. They can act quickly at a localized site of entry or a systemic site of entry, depending on what specific pathogen we're looking at and how widespread the contamination of our body is with that pathogen. And then finally, we have the third line of defense. This third line of defense has an entire chapter in your textbook dedicated to it, and it tends to be a little bit more complicated. This is known as our acquired immunities. This acquired immunity is going to be done on an individual basis, from person to person to person, and typically is always going to require exposure to the pathogen, to the microbe, before it can be developed. This third line of defense provides long-term immunity. Now, if we look at our defenses, they typically are going to be overlapping and redundant. The second and third and first lines of defense can all work at the same time. Typically, we have the first and second lines of defense work in conjunction, or the second and third lines of defense working in conjunction with each other. So we have these three different approaches that we use to keep pathogens out of our body. This combination of three approaches makes it very unlikely that any one specific pathogen will get into our bodies, establish an infection, and make us sick. The problem is we are assaulted every day by millions to billions of different pathogens. So eventually, a couple of them slip past our defenses, but the overwhelming majority of them are going to be eliminated. So let's look at this fabulous figure from your text. We have our defense system. We have our non-specific defense, which we're focusing on primarily in this discussion or this chapter, and then the next chapter focuses mostly on our acquired or specific defenses. We have physical and chemical barriers that make up the first line of defense. Our second line of defense is going to consist of generalized mechanisms in our body to keep pathogens out. And then finally, that third line of defense is going to depend on our lymphocytes, our B and T lymphocytes that develop specific immunity. More on that in the next chapter. This chapter we're focusing on first and second lines of defense. And to review briefly again, our first line of defense is chemical barriers and physical barriers, whereas our second line of defense is going to depend on Phagocytosis, so general macrophages or cells that will swallow phagocytized pathogens, the inflammation response, the fever response, and a series of antimicrobial proteins that we have in our body that are going to destroy generalized pathogens. So let's start with our first line of defense. Step number 1, we have our skin. At the surface, the most superficial layer of our skin, the stratum corneum, is on the surface of our epidermis. And think back to human anatomy. For those of you taking human anatomy, our epidermis is broken up into 5 layers with the stratum corneum on top, most superficial, and the stratum basale as the deepest layer. The stratum corneum consists of fully keratinized cells that are very tough and waterproof. The stratum corneum is also going to be constantly sloughing off superficial cells. This constant release of cells from the surface of the stratum corneum means that any pathogens that are trying to burrow through the stratum corneum need to burrow faster than the cells are being sloughed off. As we slough off our keratinized skin cells from the stratum corneum, we also inadvertently slough off pathogens that are trying to gain access to our bodies. A good spot to get in through the stratum corneum, though, is going to be hair shafts. Hair shafts are going to perforate the epidermis and go and originate in the dermis of our body. These hair shafts, with their roots in the dermis of our body, are going to have access to blood flow or blood vessels. These hair shafts, though, are periodically shed to help minimize the chance of infection through the hair shaft. We also are going to have some sebaceous glands and some sudoriferous glands, aka sweat glands. And these sweat glands or sudoriferous glands are going to release a very salty or saline solution. And this saline solution causes our skin to be inhospitable to many microbes. There's a very select category of microbes that can live and thrive on the surface of our bodies. And these microbes, are generally speaking, are halotolerant or halophiles. And that's all thanks to the fact that we get sweaty. There is an upside to not showering. If you go a long time without showering, you will have lots of salt on your skin, which will make it very difficult for some specific strains of microbes to live on your skin. The downside is people tend to avoid you because you smell bad. We also have some mucous membranes. These mucous membranes are typically going to function for the tubes that travel through our body. So our respiratory tract and our gastrointestinal tract. This mucous coating is going to focus on trapping and capturing bacteria before they can burrow through the underlying tissue layers. Our mucosa is also going to have mechanisms in place to remove the mucus with the bacteria present in that mucus for elimination. If we look at our eyes, we have small amounts of mucus being produced at our eyes, and we're also going to have special enzymes and proteins present within our tears to help minimize the amount of bacterial contamination that can enter our body through our eyes. The tear production itself also helps to minimize microbial access because we're constantly washing our eyes with a stream of sterile liquid or nearly sterile fluid. In our mouth, we have a constant flow of saliva. This constant flow of saliva, it helps to minimize the concentration of bacteria in our mouth and will flush that bacteria down our esophagus into our stomach for disposal of the bacteria or microbes. A common problem for individuals that have salivary gland malfunction is if their mouth dries out, many times the microbial concentration in their mouth will skyrocket and they'll very shortly afterwards lose their teeth. If we have high concentrations of microbes in our gastrointestinal tract that are pathogenic, we can vomit them out if they're in the upper GI tract, or we can induce diarrhea and defecate them out if they're in the lower GI tract. This helps to purge those pathogenic microbes from our body. Yes, vomiting and diarrhea are unpleasant, but they are an excellent defense mechanism to get the microbes out. In our respiratory tract, we have multiple modes of defense. Those big hairs that are growing in your external nares, aka your nostrils, actually serve a good purpose. They help to trap large particles that are trying to gain access to your body. And when I say large particles, I mean things like bugs or insects that are trying to get into your bodies. We also have lots and lots of mucus in our respiratory tract. This mucus helps to capture the microbes, the spores, the grains of pollen, and the bacterial cells that are moving through the air. This mucus that's constantly being produced is moved from the upper and lower respiratory tracts via a mucociliary escalator. So there'll be many ciliated cells in the mucus layer, and these ciliated cells move the mucus up from your lower respiratory tract, through the larynx to the pharynx. And the pharynx, for those of you who haven't taken humanity, is essentially the back of the throat. And after that mucus is moved to the pharynx, to the back of our throat, we can then swallow it and send the mucus plus the pollen, spores, mold, and bacteria down to our stomach for disposal. We also have a sneeze reflex. This sneeze reflex is going to remove larger particles from our respiratory tract at high velocities as we expunge or force air from our respiratory tracts at incredibly high velocities. If any foreign matter will get into our bronchi, trachea, or farther down into our lower respiratory tract, we have a site known as the cornea that can initiate the coughing reflex, or even farther down, we have alveolar macrophages that will help to phagocytize any irritants that make it into our lower respiratory tract. It goes without saying that as we look at our respiratory tract, individuals that smoke are going to have impaired primary defenses in the respiratory tract due to the carcinogens and toxic compounds present that are in smoke. In our urinary tract, or genitourinary tract, depending on which gender you're looking at, we have multiple lines of defense. In the urinary tract, we have a continuous trickle of urine going from our kidneys to the urinary bladder through the ureters. This continuous flow of urine helps to make it difficult for microbes to get up to the kidneys. They have to swim upstream against the current. And then from our urinary bladder to the outside of our body, we have a flow of urine that flushes out the urethra periodically when we micturate or urinate. We also, for females that is, are going to have constant vaginal secretions. There are mucus glands present in both the vaginal cavity itself and also in the vulva and between the labia minora. And these mucus secretions are going to help to maintain the correct pH and microbial content of the vulva and lower respiratory tract in females. It helps to compensate for the typically short urethra that are present in females. Another important primary defense that we have is normal or resident biota. This normal biota is neither harmful nor necessarily helpful, but it does serve an important purpose in crowding out the potentially pathogenic microbes. Our nonspecific defenses and specific immunity is dependent on this normal biota that we have present. It trains, so to speak, our host defenses to help us recognize what is good and what is bad in our body. It's been found that individuals that don't have a healthy, robust population of normal biota in their body, established early on during their childhood, are more likely to develop allergies, asthma, and other immune disorders later on in life. If we look at inflammatory bowel diseases, it's been linked to an overzealous attempt to rid our environment from microbes. We found that our gut defenses need to be trained properly with our normal resident biota. If our gut defenses are ill-trained, they are going to respond inappropriately because they didn't have the correct microbial exposure to let us know how to respond. So here we can see an overview of our primary defenses. We have in our respiratory tract a mucociliary escalator that moves mucus up and out. We have lots of mucus in our upper respiratory tract. All of that mucus is going to eventually get funneled towards the esophagus and down to the stomach. In our mouth, we have saliva with its lysozymes present. In our ears, we have crumen, aka earwax, to help minimize pathogen entry. It should also be mentioned that there are lots of guard hairs or viscerae in the ears as well to help keep pathogens from entering. In the urinary tract, we have constant flushing, constant movement of the urine through the urinary tract to help make it difficult for microbes to gain access, in addition to mucus production in the genitourinary tract. And in our digestive tract, we have constant one-way motion through the digestive tract, flushing bacteria out of our bodies. If we were to look at this figure right here, we can see our nostrils or nares. And these nostrils or nares are where we have the guard hairs present in our upper respiratory tract. And then the entire upper respiratory tract right here is lined with mucus that gets funneled towards the esophagus, which is posterior to the larynx and the trachea. Within the trachea itself, we are going to have ciliated cells, and these ciliated cells are going to move the mucus superiorly up towards the pharynx so that the mucus can be swallowed. In this figure, we can also see that there are bacterial cells present in the mucus. It's worth noting that the cilia on the ciliated cells are longer and are functioning to move the bacteria in the mucus, but we also have patches, of microvilli. And these microvilli patches are periodically spaced throughout the mucociliary escalator and allows our body to sample and monitor the composition of the mucus so that we can adjust as necessary to maintain homeostasis. So those are our physical defenses. We also have some chemical defenses. If we look at our sebaceous secretions, or if we look at our oil glands secretes, or sebaceous glands secrete sebum, aka oil, to a common person, and there are going to be some antimicrobial proteins present in the secretions from our oil glands. These glands in our eyes, not the salivary glands, but the glands that produce our tears, will lubricate our eyes with antimicrobial proteins. And the lining of our eye that gets lubricated is known as the conjunctiva. The conjunctiva is a term that refers to the structure that connects the whites of our eye and anchors the whites of our eye into our optical or ocular cavity. Present in our tears and saliva, we have lysozymes. This lysozyme is an enzyme that lyses bacterial cells. It will take the peptidoglycan that makes up the cell wall of the bacterial cell and hydrolyze it. And as that peptidoglycan is being hydrolyzed, one covalent bond at a time, the bacterial cell wall loses its structural integrity, and then the bacterial cell will burst or lyse. We also have lots of salt in our sweat, as I mentioned earlier, so lots of electrolytes, aka sodium chloride, in our sweat, and there's also a high acid content in our sweat. And if we look at the surface of our skin, if this acidic pH and fatty acid content that comes from the sebaceous secretions and the acidic nature that comes from our sweat or sudoriferous secretions make the surface of our skin very inhospitable to microbes. If we look in our stomach, we have lots of hydrochloric acid. This gives our stomach a pH of 2. It's at a concentration of about 0.1 molar. And this pH of 2 causes many microbial proteins to denature when those microbes meet stomach acid. If that wasn't enough, we also have digestive enzymes present in our digestive tract, in the stomach, in the beginning of the small intestine, the duodenum, and these digestive juices, in conjunction with the bile, are very destructive to the microbes. And it's not as if the highly acidic nature of the stomach wasn't enough to denature the proteins of the microbe. If we move on to the first part of the small intestine, the bile and the secretions from our pancreas cause the duodenum to have an alkaline pH, slightly above 8. So there's a huge fluctuation in pH from 2 to 8 as the microbes are moving through our digestive tract. And that huge fluctuation in pH helps to denature and destroy many microbes. If we look at semen, for the males that are in the audience, semen contains a combination of antimicrobial and antifungal chemicals, and the vaginal canal and vagina in general has an acidic pH that is maintained by the flora that are bacteria that are normally present going through fermentative processes. We also, on an individual basis, are going to have differences in our genetics. Some people are genetically predisposed to contract a specific disease or to resist infection from a specific pathogen. For instance, if we looked at people from European descent, individuals of European descent have a genetic predisposition to resist the bubonic plague or Black Death. Why is that? Because most people from Europe have an ancestor that has lived through, if you go back far enough or enough generations, has an ancestor or two that has lived through the bubonic plague. And the individuals that weren't genetically resistant were more likely to be killed off. And that's true of many diseases that are localized to specific ethnic groups. The individuals of African descent are genetically predispositioned to resist diseases that are native to Africa. Same thing for Southeast Asia, Northern Asia, Australia, so on and so forth. We can lose immunity or lose our normal immunity sometimes though, but this is typically not the case. Every now and again though, you'll see a patient with a severe burn. With that severe burn, they lose a very important component of their primary defense. And a primary concern we have as potential healthcare providers is that we need to prevent infection for a patient that has that severe burn because they no longer have their skin intact to keep the microbes out. Or if we have some kind of a blockage in some of the glandular secretions, those chemical defenses and the physical flushing mechanism from that gland is no longer going to be able to help the individual resist infection, and they are at an increased risk of developing an infection. Our first line of defense, though, is not sufficient all by itself. Microbes will always get past the first line of defense. As wonderful as that first line of defense is, it's not infallible. We also are going to have inflammation, phagocytosis, and specific immune responses to help compensate for the inadequacies of our primary defense mechanisms. So, concept check class. For each of the following barriers below, state whether it's a physical, chemical, or genetic barrier. If you don't know the answer off the top of your head, that's okay. You can rewind the video, you can flip back in your PowerPoint slides, or you can check your textbook. Find me an answer and pause the video and find me the answers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we look at answer A right here, or option A, hydrochloric acid is a chemical barrier. If we look at sloughing off of the skin, that is a physical barrier. Lysozymes in the saliva and tear is a chemical barrier. Oofta. Excuse me. This one is fairly straightforward if we look at D. Mutations in the genes for complement proteins, which we haven't talked about specifically, but the fact that we talk about mutations in the genome or genes clearly means that's a genetic barrier. And then our ciliary escalator in our respiratory tract is a physical barrier to infection. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them on the discussion board. Here we go. Or shoot me an email. Happy studies.